He's well known for his contributions on research on gender, sexuality and violence. I think it's fair to say, Michael didn't want me to do an introduction like this, but I think it's fair to say that Michael is one of the preeminent scholars on masculinity internationally.
Excuse me while I put gaff tape on. It's a personal thing.
His extensive research publications span areas such as fathering, homophobia and of course pornography. But Michael is more than a scholar. He works at the interface of research and policy, working alongside community and government sectors, playing an important role in contributing to violence prevention initiatives and to men's anti-violence activism. In 2006, he received a New South Wales Violence Against Women Prevention Award, one of 10 awards given each year, for playing an important role in raising community and professional awareness of the issue of violence prevention. Michael provides an important and sought-after voice in critical masculinities and gender studies. So it's a real honour to have you here today to share some of your ideas with us. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. And look, this day is a tough act to follow, I have to say. I mean, it's been a pretty amazing day, a very amazing and inspiring day in terms of presentations that were profound and personal and moving and troubling, presentations that were sophisticated and engaging and thoughtful and so on. And so I come at the end of that as the kind of sort of last voice. But yeah, it's certainly a tough act to follow, and it's been a very impressive day. As Nicholas said, my work's been about men and gender, men and masculinities, and a number of different dimensions of that. And in the last few years, it's focused particularly on the role that men can play in stopping men's violence against women. And I'm lucky enough to, just this month, I'm starting a 4-year research grant that pulls me out of teaching. I love teaching, but it pulls me out of teaching. 4 years of research focused on men's roles in violence prevention. And I'll certainly be coming across the Tasman to talk to people in New Zealand about the good work that's being done here and to continue to foster that kind of exchange. But one of the bits of work I've done is about pornography. It started out, in fact, about children's and young people's exposure to pornography. And more recently, I've looked a little at men's involvements in pornography, and this talk is about that. It's about shifting men's relationships to pornography. And so, I'm going to start with, I suppose, some basic stuff about pornography. And I actually was tempted to just cross it out altogether, given that we're running late. But I thought, some of this might actually be useful. So I'll do a bit of this. So what do I mean by pornography? And in fact, this is a definition that was echoed earlier today. Sexually explicit media that are intended to arouse the audience. I'm not going to show you any pornography today, but that's the definition. So this is a very ecumenical definition. It's a broad definition. So it might include 50 Shades of Grey or text. It might include visual imagery, photos, videos, and so on. Depictions of bodies, of sex, and so on. You can see this is a neutral, not a normative definition. It could imply that there's good and bad pornography if you were so inclined. It's certainly not a political definition of pornography or a normative definition of pornography. But if we look at the industry, we see powerful gender patterns in terms of who uses pornography, whether we're talking about commercial mass market pornography or other forms of sexually explicit material. And there's kind of scads of data, a wealth of data that shows you that most of the users of pornography are heterosexual men, and that looking at and masturbating to pornography is the routine practice of large numbers of men and some women. And most of the commercial pornography industry caters to heterosexual men. So in fact, if you compare gay men and heterosexual men, gay men are more frequent users of pornography, but given what proportion of the population gay men are, most pornography is used by heterosexual men, if you see what I mean. And there's a series of kind of gender contrasts in terms of what men and women think about pornography, how aroused they are by it, how often they use it. And in fact, those categories, that gender contrast is also true among boys and young men, girls and young women, and also some further differences too. Girls and young women are less likely than boys and young men to use porn for sexual excitement and masturbation. Boys and men are more likely to initiate its use rather than be introduced to it by a partner. Boys and men are more likely to view it alone, more likely to view it in same-sex groups, and to look at a wider range of images and so on. So that's a kind of lightning quick account of some simple patterns to do with porn use. And there are some really interesting shifts. There's not good Australian data on this, but there is US data to show that rates of exposure again is a broad term, it means deliberate, consumption of pornography and also accidental exposure to pornography, that the age of exposure is declining in the US. So people have done longitudinal research following groups of young people over time and found that average ages of exposure are getting younger. And the proportions of younger groups who've seen porn is increasing over time. There's also shifts, of course, in how people are seeing porn. So we've got internet-enabled phones, other forms of technology are facilitating new means of exposure and distribution. Having said that, still traditional media like DVDs are still a very common form of porn consumption. Shifts to, in the wider context of pornography, people talk about pornographication that overlaps with sexualisation and so on, and certainly evidence that pornography's content itself is shifting in terms of the types of practices shown, the types of bodies shown, the diversity of practices shown, and the degree of hostility or callousness and aggression that's typical in pornography. There's evidence that all those things are shifting, in some cases in troubling directions. So I'm going to talk about effects, and unlike some cultural studies scholars, I'm quite happy to talk about media effects, although I want to do so in, hopefully in intelligent ways. So research on pornography's effects. Let's say we wanted to do some research on the impacts of pornography consumption. There'd be three broad ways to do it, three broad kinds of studies. One is, and again I've said we won't do this, I could measure your attitudes and behaviours related to, for example, sex or aggression and so on, then show you a bunch of pornography, show you, say, 4 hours of pornography in a laboratory, and then measure your attitudes and behaviours again, and do so again a week from now or 6 months from now, a kind of laboratory-based study. I could do a correlational study where rather than using a lab, we just survey people in the population. Do they use porn? What type of porn? How often? And also ask about attitudes and behaviours and so on. And so look for correlations between pornography use and certain sorts of behaviours and attitudes. Or we could do longitudinal studies where we follow groups of people over time and compare the people who use porn and the people who don't over time and so on. Now, these various studies, the methodology of these studies is debated. Some people say laboratory studies are artificial. You're looking at pornography in a laboratory environment in the psych lab of this university or wherever, and that's different from the ways people typically use pornography, where they're masturbating to pornography in their own bedroom or on the bus or wherever it is. But in fact, so some people say, look, laboratory studies are artificial, and in fact, the critique that I'd come back to in response to that is, yeah, they are. In fact, they're likely to underestimate the likely impacts of pornography, because often laboratory studies show people pornography only for, say, 4 hours, which is, for many people, that's a day's use, not much more than that. And you're not masturbating typically in the laboratory, whereas masturbating to pornography in some ways intensifies the kind of, emotional or kind of psychic investment that you have in that material and so on. So there's a bunch of debates about methodology, but I'm certainly persuaded that there's a really robust body of evidence now that tells us that pornography consumption has demonstrable and significant effects on attitudes, effects on behaviours. And again, there are some caveats. Caveats on impact. And the caveats to do with the kinds of factors that mediate the impact of exposure. So the characteristics of the person watching pornography matter. So for example, I've got a 5-year-old girl. I suspect if she was shown pornography, again, not something we do, but if she was shown pornography, I don't think she'd be able to make much sense of it. I don't think it would mean to her what it might mean to my 9-year-old, or indeed to my 9-year-old 6 years from now when he's a 15-year-old boy. And so age and maturation, sexual experience, cultural background, various kinds of factors at the individual level shape the kind of meanings and significance of pornography use. Another factor, of course, is how people engage with that material. Do they see it as realistic, for example? Are they kind of active and involved viewers? Are they, what meaning do they give to that material? And a third factor is the kind of character and circumstances of that consumption of pornography. What type of material are they looking at? How long are they looking at it for? Is it voluntary? Are they choosing to do so? Is it solitary? Is it collective? And so on. So I can imagine, and people haven't looked at this closely, but we know there are likely to be differences. Likely to be differences in, say, a 16-year-old boy looking at pornography by himself, 4 nights a week, or looking at pornography on a Friday night with a bunch of mates, in a kind of party context. There may be differences in what that means and how that works. So I'm going to shift now to some claims about effects. And in fact, I'm going to claim that there are six demonstrated effects of pornography consumption. And some of them aren't necessarily bad at all. Has anyone heard the feminist slogan, pornography is the theory, rape is the practice? Michael Kimmel, a US sociologist, he playfully says pornography is the theory, masturbation is the practice. And I'm definitely pro-masturbation. I think we all should masturbate. Hands up if you masturbate. I bet you use that hand. So masturbation's a good thing. So I want to be clear, there's a certain kind of vilifying of sex that is easy to fall into. I don't think I fall into it, but I think sometimes I've been heard as falling into that. So I want to be clear, some of these effects, in fact, can be seen as positive effects. I hope I cut you off before you put your hands up, but I hope in an ideal circumstance, you all would have put your hands up, because masturbation's a good thing. So one thing pornography does is it shapes our knowledge and our attitudes. Kind of surprise, surprise. If you look at children and young people who look at pornography or consume other kinds of sexual content in media and so on, they know more about sex. They know more about pregnancy and menstruation and homosexuality and prostitution and so on. And so if you then talk to consumers, for example, to boys and men who consume porn, one of the things they say is it helped them learn about bodies, about female and male bodies and sexual techniques and so on. There's evidence too that pornography use shapes a kind of liberalisation of attitudes, that people who look at porn also are more likely to be accepting of premarital and extramarital sexual relations. They're more likely to assume that their peers are sexually active. They have more favourable attitudes towards casual sex and indeed towards pornography itself. So pornography is a source of sex education, in a sense, of sexual knowledge and attitudes. Pornography is also a source of sex education in terms of its impact on people's actual sexual practice, their sexual expectations and their actual sexual practice, their sexual repertoire, the kinds of things they do and like doing. And there's good evidence that pornography consumption among males, and I keep focusing on males because politically I think that's important and because most consumers are male, pornography consumption is shaping young men's interest in anal intercourse. And in fact, no fewer than 5 studies from Sweden. I'm amazed, this stuff gets funded, it's very impressive. But 5 studies in Sweden found that among young men, those young men who used porn were more likely to be interested in anal sex than those young men who didn't use porn, more likely to have had anal intercourse with a girl than those guys who didn't use porn, and that girls too who'd seen pornography also were more likely to have had anal intercourse. So there's good evidence that porn shapes sexual practice. And you may not know, but anal intercourse has become an absolute staple in heterosexual porn. Anal intercourse is a routine depiction in porn showing men and women having sex with each other. And I think that's shaping men's expectations about sex. And you might say, well, what's the problem? What's the problem with anal sex? If God had meant men to have, men and women to have sex, he would have put holes in the middle of their bottoms. But the problem becomes when this becomes a kind of coercive or abusive expectation. And I do think, again, the evidence of this is, there's some good evidence of this from a UK study. In fact, I think it was mentioned this morning, wasn't it? Yeah, some evidence of young women feeling under increasing pressure to participate in anal intercourse and kind of growing levels of kind of coercion or the kind of normalisation of a practice that's not necessarily that pleasurable for some women. And so porn is shaping men's interest in anal sex and involvement in anal sex. Yeah, it's also, I think, is likely to be shaping an interest in other kinds of practices that are also very common in pornography. For example, ejaculating on the face, extravaginal ejaculation. Also things like double and triple penetration, multiple partner sex, and other kinds of particular sexual practices. And there's probably some complex things going on here. That one thing that may be going on is you've got young men who are kind of sexually adventurous or experimental, and using porn and experimenting with different kinds of sexual practices like anal sex. But there's probably also causal relationships going on. So on this one too, porn as sex education, porn is one place where same-sex attracted young people, young gay, lesbian, queer and transgender young people and others of course, can find affirmations of their sexual or gender identities. In a context where, at school for example, same-sex sexualities are silenced or marginalised, porn can be one place where you get to see how men have sex with men and women have sex with women and so on. So porn, has been a kind of positive, safe space in some ways for some same-sex attracted young people. Another effect is a very different type of one, and this is about porn as betrayal. Now, lots of people argue that porn can be a kind of healthy part of sexual intimacy in couple relationships, couples using porn to spice up the sex life or as part of their sexual involvement. And obviously there's some preconditions for that. Presumably, it's more likely to be healthy if its use is freely chosen and shared and so on. But in heterosexual relationships, I think that in large part those conditions are not met. I think that there are large numbers of heterosexual men who use porn and hide their porn use from their female partners, or whose female partners turn a blind eye to their porn use, kind of not keen on it, not comfortable with it, but kind of let it happen because of course all men use porn. Now there's been research on how women feel about their male partner's porn use, and what it finds is the majority of women have a kind of neutral attitude towards it. They're kind of okay about it, don't mind it, that kind of thing. But from a big British study, about a third do have a serious negative experience of their male partner's porn use. They experience it as a kind of affair or betrayal. They feel like it has a negative impact on their sexual life or their relationships. They feel less attractive and desirable, in the context of their male partner's porn use. So I'm not wanting to say, it's experienced as betrayal by all women whose male partners use porn, but certainly by substantial proportions. The fourth one there is porn as addiction. There's a whole lot of scholarship now. In fact, there's a dedicated journal of sexual addiction. There's a whole lot of scholarship using notions of sexual addiction and pornography addiction. And I don't like the notion of addiction. I think it implies a model of porn use, like models of drug use, which is problematic. One taste and you're hooked. All use is necessarily compulsive and destructive and so on. And I think that's misleading. But it's also true, clearly, that there are some consumers of porn who find themselves using porn in ways that are compulsive, obsessive, and that start to do harm to their work life, their family life, and so on. I think there are some patterns of use that clearly are kind of habitual or compulsive and have negative impacts. And rather than thinking of them as addictions, they're more like impulse control disorders. They're more like eating disorders or pathological gambling in terms of how they play out. So porn as addiction is the fourth effect. The last two are really the ones that I've been most troubled about. And the fifth of these is about pornography as sexist education. So correlational studies, experimental studies, both show, when it comes to, say, mainstream media, we're not even on to porn yet, but mainstream media, that if you consume mainstream media which sexualises and what's the verb? Derivatizes, thank you. That derivatizes women, then that shapes derivatizing attitudes towards women in everyday life. And that adolescents and young adults who consume kind of stereotypes and sexist media are more likely to agree with those kinds of beliefs. Likewise, the consumption of pornography is associated with more sexualised views of women. And in fact, there have been some fascinating studies that suggest that the consumption of pornography feeds into the actual sexualised treatment of women. So these amazing studies where people kind of look at porn and then they, so laboratory study, you look at porn and then you're meant to walk down the corridor to some other place where you fill in a survey. But to do that, you have to ask someone which way to go, and the experiment is actually about how you treat the person you ask where to go, not about what you then fill in. And what it finds out is that when men are exposed to sexualised content, they're more likely to treat women in sexualised ways, including in this kind of, these kind of casual interactions. So there's good evidence about pornography shaping sexually objectifying or derivatized, and sexist views of women and sexuality and so on. The last one is the most troubling of all, about pornography, and this is too blunt, this is too polemical really for an academic context, but pornography as rape training. This is an argument that pornography shapes sexual violence, and these relationships are complex, but certainly I think there's a kind of robust relationship between pornography consumption, and sexual aggression. So we look at attitudes. Experimental studies find a strengthening of attitudes supportive of rape or sexual aggression following exposure to pornography. So greater acceptance of rape myths, greater victim blaming, greater acceptance of sexual callousness and so on. And also laboratory studies also show an increase in behavioural aggression, again following exposure to pornography. There are correlational studies as well out in the population that look at men's and women's use of pornography and their attitudes towards or their involvements in sexual violence, and again find systematic relationships between them. That those men who are using porn, and particularly violent porn, are also more likely to agree with sexual violence and to be using sexual violence themselves. Now, I'm not wanting to say here that rape is reducible to or solely explainable in terms of pornography, but I think that pornography is one enabling condition. It's one discursive influence. It's one ideological force, whatever language you want to use, but it plays some role in patterns of sexual violence. So that's enough. That's enough on kind of porn and the kind of likely impacts of porn. I want to shift now to questions of strategy. Questions of what the hell we do about it. And it turns out there's quite a lot of effort focused on shifting men's relationship to pornography. And I'm going to talk about, I think it's kind of 4 or so responses. And I'm focused here on social and educational strategies, not on legal or technological strategies, to shift our relationships to porn just by making it illegal, for example, or removing it from, public view. Instead, I'm talking about social strategies that are addressed particularly to in men in many cases. So the strategy that I, until recently, was most aware of was kind of Christian abstinence. And I'm going to actually talk about 3 different kinds of abstinence-based strategy. This, when I first started thinking about this about 4 years ago, this was the most prominent strategy, the most prominent kind of social response to the problem of men's pornography use. And it came from Christians, from the Christian church and from chastity ministries and so on. And it involves Christian pastors and Christian centres and texts exhorting men to abandon pornography, to seek the forgiveness of their wives, to renew their vows to their God and to their marriage, and to quit pornography. So it's a kind of a faith-based response. And it's very much a logical extension of traditional Christian hostility to sex outside marriage, to sex for sex's sake, to masturbation, and to sex outside the boundaries of married heterosexual monogamy. It's still very powerful, certainly very prominent. If you Google quitting pornography, this will be one of the main kinds of responses you will find. And there are kind of popular texts out there like Wendy Matz's book, The Porn Trap, which isn't explicitly Christian, but which overlaps with some of this kind of work on pornography addiction. Now, in terms of, what do we think? What do we think of this approach? Well, politically, I'm very hostile to its assumptions about sexuality and appropriate forms of sexuality. I suppose theologically, I'm also hostile because I don't believe there is any God, but that's another issue. Its appeal is limited. Its appeal is limited because it appeals primarily to Christian adherents, and its kind of narrow assumptions, its narrow sexual prescriptions about desirable or legitimate sex really run up against the values, the norms of a much more sexually liberal and diverse culture, a very powerful sexual culture, which simply would throw out the door many of its assumptions about sex. Anyway, so that's Christian abstinence. Now, 4 years ago when I first started writing this, I didn't know at all about this second response, but this second response turns out to be the biggest of the abstinence-based responses. It's a more secular response. So again, focused on porn addiction and sex addiction, using some of the same language, involving books, blogs and so on, but not with the same Christian assumptions. Sometimes still deeply hostile to masturbation, so deeply hostile to pornography use, but for ostensibly more secular reasons to do with addiction and personal and moral harm. It does overlap, in fact, so on. But some of it, for example, draws on notions of brain chemistry and the idea that pornography actually changes your brain's functioning. It lessens your dopamine receptors and actually leads to erectile dysfunction. So often the concern is about sexual performance, and pornography is seen to limit men's sexual functioning because of the way it rewires the brain. So there's websites and books like yourbrainonporn.com. But in terms of raw numbers, there are one of the biggest online communities. I became aware of this thing that a whole lot of people knew about, this kind of large online community of men, largely of men, dedicated to quitting pornography. And this community and others like it have emerged only in the last few years. And the biggest one with is called NoFap. FAP is a colloquial term, I'd never heard it, but a colloquial term for masturbation. NoFap has 130,000 participants, so we're talking serious numbers of men. And so it's on Reddit, which is a kind of entertainment and social networking website. And people who sign up for this are Fapstronauts, and Fapstronauts take the challenge. They take the challenge of conquering the urge to masturbate, or FAP, and or use porn. So some of them give up masturbation, some of them give up porn. There's kind of debate about this for a certain time or permanently and so on. And there's various things going on here. What they're trying to avoid is PMO. PMO is porn, masturbation, orgasm, this kind of cycle of pornography use, masturbation and ejaculation. And there's various things going on for these participants. For some of them, it's about stopping what feels like a kind of compulsive or obsessive habit of porn use and masturbation. For some of them, it's about taking control of their sexuality. For some of them, it's about improving their sexual confidence or their ability with women, because they're actually overwhelmingly young men in their teens and 20s, which again I was surprised by, and overwhelmingly heterosexual. For some of them, it's about following Christian religion. But NoFap is not defined by shared religious commitment. It's not a Christian site. There are Christians on it, but they explicitly say don't post stuff about God or debating theology on this. There's an explicit kind of inclusiveness to various perspectives. And so on. And there's various other forums as well. There's one called, I think it's called Reboot Nation. There's another one called Porn Free. And these are kind of large online communities. And I don't know if 130,000 people on Reddit is a lot or a little. I mean, I don't know enough about social media to know, but for me that was pretty extraordinary to kind of find these numbers. And some of the participants on this forum are critical of the first mob, the Christian-based abstinence mob. They say that approach is based much more on shame, on rigid notions of the kind of condemnation of masturbation and so on, and say, this stuff is much better. And one of the things I noticed about these forums are they're incredibly supportive. These kind of men saying, I've gone 60 days without PMO, but I'm really struggling not to relapse, or I had a relapse, what can I do? And these other guys saying, you're doing a great job, keep it up, here's what you can do. And this incredible kind of supportive community of men, largely of men, encouraging each other to give up masturbation and pornography. Again, fascinating. And in terms of the kind of advice they actually give, it's basically cognitive psychology. It's basically cognitive psychology and some other kind of behaviour change strategies. Practical strategies focused on unhealthy thoughts and behaviours and kind of tips and advice and so on. So in terms of the assessment, I just want to see where I go. In terms of the assessment, this is a really strongly supportive community of men trying to shift their relationships to pornography. So, we want men to shift their relationships to pornography, send them off to NoFap. Well, maybe. One issue is the strategies for change are highly individual. They're focused on personal shifts in habits, not changing the industry, not tackling, or doing something about a multi-billion-dollar porn industry. The strategies are about personal growth and healing, not about social activism and social change. And if they were about social activism, I'm not sure that I'd be that keen either, actually. I'd be a bit nervous. One thing this community is not, and these efforts are not, is feminist. There's no substantive feminist analysis going on there. And Reddit has some seriously unsavoury communities and activists on it, including very energetic men's rights and kind of anti-feminist men's groups. And this, I haven't looked at NoFap closely enough to know, but I'm guessing there may be some overlap between this and men's rights groups, particularly because there's kind of a defensiveness or hostility around feminism. Not an overt, we are an anti-feminist site, but some hostility there. Okay. The sort of strategy that I'm politically, in a sense, most comfortable with, but it also is flawed, is this third abstinence strategy, which of course is a feminist or pro-feminist strategy. This is the most marginalised of the three abstinence strategies. It sees pornography as a kind of, as patriarchal ideology, and the sex industry is patriarchal and misogynist. Men should quit pornography and forge ethical and sexual gender relations with women and other men. And the book cover there is Robert Jensen's book, Getting Off. That's kind of, I suppose, the most prominent argument here directed to men. Of course, there's lots of feminist work about pornography, but in terms of work that directs itself explicitly to men, this is one of the most prominent ones. And Jensen makes two appeals to men. One is an argument from justice. Pornography is built on and maintains women's sexual subordination, so men should stop using pornography because it's our ethical obligation to do so. It's the right thing to do. The second thing is an argument from self-interest. Pornography also dehumanises men. Pornography reinforces men's adherence to narrow ideals about, sex is about conquest and domination. Pornography lessens men's abilities to make intimate connections with a partner. It facilitates a kind of emotional numbness. He argues that using pornography is like eating fast food. It's kind of an intense sexual experience, apparently at low cost, but in fact not with much substance, and with long-term costs. And so Jensen's text is one of the most well-developed kind of efforts to shift men's relationships to pornography. But its strategies for men to actually do that, its strategies for what men should do, are remarkably underdeveloped. I'm looking at that book, if we could flick to the table of contents, you would hope that the last 4 chapters would be, full of kind of rich, thought-out strategies, individual and collective, for how to shift men's relationships to pornography. It's not really there. Getting Off does little to actually, provide strategy. It also is remarkably thin in terms of its vision of what kind of sexuality, what kind of sexual landscape should replace a pornographic one. It doesn't do much to address the kind of sexual and emotional desires and involvements which shape porn use, and it doesn't do much, about that. There is a whole kind of stop demand effort going on in the world, various activist groups and campaigns, including Stop Demand here in New Zealand, and kind of end demand strategies, but that's focused largely on men's roles in sex work or prostitution and also trafficking. There's been far less attention, it seems to me, on men's roles as consumers of pornography. And I'm very involved in the kind of in the work globally to do with building men's involvements in gender equality, and that work is focused very much on violence against women, on sexual and reproductive health, and on fathering, and it's paid relatively little attention to pornography. It's kind of surprising. Anyway, so what do we think of this pro-feminist, kind of pro-feminist abstinence? Well, it's more in step than Christian efforts are with, how long have I got? 10, thank you. It's more in step than Christian efforts with the kind of contemporary destabilisations of rigid heterosexual and masculine identities. It's more in step with contemporary assertions of female sexual agency. It's more in step with contemporary norms of gender equality. But again, like Christian frameworks, it's got to confront this kind of powerful patriarchal sexual norms. And of course, it's hampered by what the previous, I think, 2 presentations highlighted, which is that kind of profound stigmatising and marginalising of feminism. I think that's probably why it's the most marginal of all these 3 abstinence-based approaches. Okay, 3 more approaches, and I won't spend as much time on these. Second one is sexuality education. So if to the extent we're focused on children and young people, and so some people say, look, if children and young people are turning to porn to find out about sex, let's give them sexuality education instead. If we had better sexuality education, then children and young people would turn to porn less or stumble across porn less. And I think there's some value in that. But even the most compelling sexuality education won't satisfy young people's and indeed adults' desires for sexually explicit materials with which to masturbate. Pornography is a fairly limited sex educator too, in all sorts of ways. There's obvious ways in which it doesn't prepare people for the negotiation of consent, the negotiation of contraception and safe sex. It doesn't prepare them for the bodily diversities and the emotional complexities of lived sexual experience. So while I'm all for sexuality education, I think that this strategy alone is also limited. Another strategy is pornography education. If we think that pornography is starting to shape young people's or adults' views and behaviours when it comes to sex, then let's do something about that. And one strategy is pornography education, and this is something in which I've been involved, which is let's figure out ways to increase, for example, young men's critical responses to pornography, their critical reading of the typical themes and messages and meanings in pornography so that they're more resistant to pornography if and when they see it. So a kind of pornography education, and certainly some people are starting to do this, and in fact there's good evidence that you can inoculate people against, for example, violent supportive messages in porn. If you, there's kind of experimental study, 2 groups of people, both shown the same kind of violent pornography which endorses rape, but one of the groups was kind of inoculated by being kind of reminded that the material is fictional and that women don't, in fact, enjoy being coerced into sex, and the other group is not told anything. And then after the violent porn, their attitudes are assessed, and those group who were inoculated take on the kind of pro-rape messages of porn less. So you can debrief, and in fact this comes up, there was someone here who has a PhD student who's going to look at last 40 years of porn. I can't remember who that was, Jan. Yeah, and so debriefing is important, but inoculation might also be important too, if you see what I mean, prior to that exposure to porn use. Another strategy is integrating pornography education into school curricula. And there's actually a really good project in Victoria, in Australia, that's doing just that. That's writing curricula to be integrated into the personal health and, what's it called? Personal and health development. I can't remember what it's called. Curricula in schools in Victoria. So kind of slotting into school curricula materials about pornography and typical messages in pornography and trying to invite more critical responses to pornography. That's part of what it's doing. It's also produced a documentary movie that was mentioned earlier today as well called Love and Sex in an Age of Pornography, and contributing to public debate. And this is a project by Marie Crabb and Dave Corlett, and I think they've been out here as well talking about some of this work. And I think these are promising strategies too, strategies of pornography education, encouraging critical literacy and so on. The final strategy, and you might be surprised to hear this one, is better porn. If our problem is with some of the particular ways in which pornography represents women or the particular kinds of sexual acts it celebrates and so on, well then presumably we could call for or produce or participate in better pornography. And I'm curious to ask, hands up, and this is a genuine hands up, I won't cut you off this time, hands up who thinks that an ethical pornography is possible. So in other words, the ethical depiction of people having sex. Wow. What does it look like? Seriously, what does it look like? Mutual. Mutual? Yeah? Okay. So it's real? What does that mean? Okay. I mean, one thing's interesting that came up earlier today about kind of amateur porn. The argument, oh, look, amateur porn's different from this nasty commercial stuff. And it seems to me that if I, for example, wanted to film myself having sex with someone, I bet my notions of what looks good and of what we should do would be really powerfully shaped by this massive porn industry that's coached us about the particular ways in which you should have sex to, for it to look good for the camera and the implied male viewer. So I think that distinction's fuzzy. But anyway, ethical porn, most of you think it could exist. What would it look like?
I feel like the camera would be focused on everyone, not just one, like often in a film, like the man's head won't even be in shot.
So not just his penis and her orifices, in other words. Yeah.
But also I have a book called The Feminist Porn Book. So
yep.
There's a whole range of people really focusing like on
making
it feminist.
Yeah, and there's debate over the notion of a feminist pornography, isn't there? Yeah, but we're starting to get to some sense of what that might look like. Up the back?
I had a few bit of contact with people involved with Make Love Not Porn, which is a site that is designed towards getting people to demonstrate the diversity of sexual practices.
Yeah, it's called Make Love Not Porn for people who didn't catch that. Yeah. Yeah.
Then you've got the lawyer who provides the legal advice for Make Love Not Porn. Her name is Jincy, and she runs a feminist lesbian porn company called My Little Pink Box.
Okay. Is this paid advertising we're getting into here? No. Okay. Anyway, so such things exist. Okay, so I'll come back to this. So, I mean, this is the good practical question. I gave a presentation at a family planning conference in New Zealand, I think last year or maybe the year before, and I had parents come up to me afterwards and say, I'm concerned about the types of materials my son masturbates to. What types of porn should I tell him he should look at? So in other words, can we work up a list of criteria for the kinds of porn that it's better or less harmful for our kids to look at? So I think it's a really interesting practical question. You know, could we give young people a kind of series of, you know, flashcards for, you know, look for porn that does X, Y, and Z. It's got the tick of approval, the, you know, the pink tick or something. Anyway, okay, so. So criteria for unethical pornography, we'd assume that, you know, the participants in that ethical pornography are doing so consentingly. It rules out child porn, rules out coerced trafficking and so on. We'd assume that its content was ethical. I think that's a really tricky thing. I think we might also assume that its use was ethical, that, you know, that its use wasn't coerced, that its use wasn't... I'm not sure about dishonest. I don't know if you have an obligation to tell your partner, if you have a sexual partner, if you're using porn. If you do you also have an obligation to tell them the content of your sexual fantasies? I don't know. These are interesting ethical questions. Okay, so I wanted to go back to kind of first principles, and that's where I wanted to end. 2 minutes? Okay. I do lots of work on engaging men in preventing men's violence against women, and there's kind of principles that are kind of well-rehearsed principles in there for what works and what doesn't work. And I wanted to just flag some of those briefly if we really are to make progress in shifting men's relationships to pornography. I think a feminist agenda has to be the kind of bottom line here. This work has to be oriented towards building gender justice or building gender equality. It has to be done in alliance with and even be accountable to women and women's groups. Now, of course, saying feminist doesn't, you know, barely resolves the debate because, as you heard, feminist sex wars, other contemporary, very heated conflicts between different strands and forms of feminism and other forms of sexual politics over transgender, over other issues. You know, saying feminist doesn't, you know, quite settle things, but, you know, it's not a bad place to start. We need kind of multi-level approaches that tackle porn use, if you think that's the problem, or problematic porn use, or the use of harmful porn, if you think they're the problems, at multiple levels. We need community strategies, institutional strategies, and so on. And so, for example, I remember when there was an activist group called Men Against Pornography. And, you know, I really like activist groups. They're an important part of social change. Men Against Pornography, which is a US group, has ceased to exist. There are still grassroots men's groups in Australia, for example, and in fact in New Zealand. There are some really good ones in New Zealand to do with men's violence. I wonder if grassroots men's groups around pornography will also emerge or take up these issues. The challenge, though, is how to appeal to men. And, you know, in a context where porn use is normative, you know, in various kinds of ways. And it seems to me you've got to somehow meet men where they're at, on the one hand, but also engage them in critical reflection on what their porn use means, on what, you know, what porn use means, how it works, and what it might mean, and so on. And there's a tricky issue here around benefit and harm. One strategy I've already mentioned is to kind of appeal to men by saying that pornography harms them as well. Yes, porn is oppressive and degrading to women or something, but pornography harms your healthy sexual development. Pornography undermines your ability to maintain healthy relationships. But I have some caution about that. It's the same caution I have around saying that men will benefit from progress towards ending violence against women. And that's because men benefit from porn use. A universe where, you know, all women are kind of sexually available to you and thrilled to bits at whatever you do to them, whether it's, you know, licking them or shitting on them, then, you know, that's a kind of comforting universe. And so there's some ways in which challenging porn or aspects of porn will involve challenging some of the patriarchal benefits that men get in a gender unjust society. So we've got to do this carefully. We've got to think about how to foster men's support for gender equality. And again, that's complicated. I'll mention a couple of these briefly because I'm running totally out of time. It's not true that all men think porn is a great thing. There's evidence that substantial proportions of men are resistant to porn or hostile to porn or see porn as problematic. So a big Swedish study among young men, 37% of males thought that porn was degrading. 60+% of young women, but 30% of young men thought that porn was degrading. So there may be forms of resistance we can draw on. We've got to somehow find hooks for men, and this is Marie Crabb and Dave Collette's work. They try to think, okay, what are some of the ways we might appeal to young men? And appealing to young men, for example, by saying, you'll be bad at sex. Use porn a lot, learn how to have sex through porn, you'll be crappy at sex and women won't like the sex you have to offer them. That may be appealing for some men, but whereas there may be other kinds of appeals as well, and there I've listed a bunch of others. Where are we up to? There are some obvious kinds of dilemmas here, and this is where I'll finish. Dilemmas about in relation to children and young people, for example, recognising sexual agency, and indeed that's true in all this work with women and men in pornography, is kind of not taking up these issues in ways that position people as only and ever victims that fail to recognise sexual agency. There's real issues around sexual explicitness, whether in a school context or at a university context, and so on. Questions of not reinforcing erotophobia, not reinforcing the kind of ways in which sex is often presumed guilty until found innocent, and so on. And the kind of ongoing challenge of recognising sexual diversity. So some final points. We've got to address the kind of wider context, the cultural context in which porn consumption takes place and within which it's given meaning. We have to avoid stigmatising masturbation or pathologising various kinds of sexual interests and fetishes. We have to mobilise existing forms of discomfort regarding porn to some ways. And more broadly, we have to build a gender-just culture. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Kia ora. Towards the end of your presentation, you talked a little bit towards agency. I wonder how you would connect the idea of agency to your earlier comments about porn as a form of representation for queer people, given that trans women specifically, but also like cis lesbian women, generally our sexual practices as they unfold in reality aren't kind of represented whatsoever in the kind of pornography which gets made about us. So I wonder how you would, how you would address the question of agency.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand your question. I mean, maybe saying this will help, that I recognise the ways in which kind of sexually explicit material for some communities has been a powerful expression of sexual agency and a way to negotiate or contest public representations of that form of sexuality or sexual practice. Yeah, I suppose that's, yeah, I'm not sure what to say.
Earlier in your talk, you talked about how men's attitude changed towards the Confederate when they were asking them where to go.
Yeah. You know the psych language that I don't. The Confederate. Okay, that's good to know. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's been any studies that looked at women's attitudes and how that changed before or after viewing pornography.
Yeah, because I've been particularly interested in impacts on men, I focused on that, but no, my understanding is that at least some studies show similar impacts among female consumers. Yeah, not in terms of sexual violence perpetration, but in terms of kind of general behavioural aggression. Yeah.
We heard a couple of times that porn is getting increasingly violent and increasingly aimed at degradation. Why? Why is this happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. And people who study the industry might know better than I do. All I know is the kind of simplistic accounts given by Gail Dines in Pornoland and some other work, which I think is not necessarily very empirically based, but it says that it's about porn producers looking for an edge in a saturated market, and kind of draws on simplistic notions of desensitisation. And I think that may be something going on, but I suspect it's more complex than that. No doubt that you're seeing shifts in the kind of content of pornography itself. And again, in some ways I'd urge you, go look at porn. It's pretty amazing to see kind of what is standard in porn these days. Yeah, so I've no doubt about the shift in content. I'm far less sure about what's shaping it, or indeed where the hell it goes next.
Thanks, Michael, for your presentation today. I've been using your work for a bit, and it's really nice to see you and hear you in person. I'm not sure if people in the room are aware, but in the late 1990s, the New Zealand Health Teachers Association put together a resource called Social and Ethical Issues in Sexuality Education, which had a section on pornography to be taught in health education in New Zealand secondary schools. So that's, since 2000, unfortunately, it's very little has been done with it because schools are really frightened of it. So while I agree with you around sexuality education and porn education being really important, I think we need many, many voices other than just those of us who work in the very small field of sexuality education to be saying and supporting schools to actually implement sexuality education right from the beginning of schooling, because I believe that this is when porn education and sexuality education starts, and teaching that critical thinking and giving the vaccination like you were talking about. So If you weren't aware of that, please, start talking about it and start asking at your school where your children go, what sexuality education is happening in your school, because unless we start asking those questions, we're just going to have the status quo, and in another 15 years we'll be sitting in this room having the same conversations. So thanks.
Thanks.
I just had a question about the research that you talked about earlier, about the correlational research that suggested using porn. And it sounded to me like you were saying using porn meant that you were more likely to have rape-supportive attitudes. But couldn't the correlation just as easily be the other way? Couldn't we say that people with rape-supportive attitudes are more likely to use porn?
Yeah, and in fact, in that slide on that, I think I said there was a circular relationship. There it is. Yeah, so it's Malamuth's research, and he and his colleagues find that kind of men who are already oriented towards kind of sexual aggression and being sexually aggressive are more attracted to porn that celebrates that, and that in itself, then can feed back and intensify that orientation. So you get circular relationships. So it's not abandoning a causal claim about pornography, but it's saying it's complicated.
I was so sad that you skipped quickly past all those last few ones, which seemed to me as the important bits. And I was just interested in what your thoughts are about, if you were given a magic wand, what would be the 2 or 3 things that would be top of your list to start doing?
It depends how magic a wand you mean. So, is it a magic wand where I can this is really playing God, where you can kind of meddle with sexual subjectivities such that, the same pictures of bodies and sex might, I'm doing something with my hands, I'll put that behind me. The same pictures of bodies and sex might be out there in the world, but we just look at them and go, oh, that means something different. Or, think of them in the same way that I recoil when I see a Big Mac, that we might, that might mean something very different. Or is it the magic wand that you're really talking about $1 million and a team of activists or something, in which case I'd be starting to think about how you challenge an industry. For example, how is it that the tobacco industry is on the back foot now in a way that it wasn't 30 years ago? I don't know. That kind of thing. Yeah, look, there's lots of research, and in fact, there's been a whole bunch of good books that have come out just in the last few years. So one was mentioned this morning, Karen Boyle's collection, Everyday Pornography. There's a number of others. If you write to me, I'm really good at lists. If people who don't know me, I'm kind of obsessed with collecting lists of what other people have done. And so I've got a bibliography on pornography, which says, here are some key recent books. Just write to me at that email address. I'll send you that list.
Just going back to what you said earlier, do you think that if the characteristics of the viewer and the character in the context of exposure and the viewer's engagement with the material are all deemed sort of like sound, do you think that it can therefore be ethical to watch this sort of content? Because I think very often we can sort of talk about men, even though we should be talking about all people who consume porn, and kind of describe them as passive viewers who are just going to adopt these ideas when actually, we're agents who have a critical eye and can look and say, I don't like that or I don't like that. I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, so I think an ethical pornography, I think there's a kind of complex set of things going on, and so for a particular instance of pornography consumption to be ethical, I suppose, or indeed unethical, I'd be looking at the content of that pornography, the patterns of its consumption, patterns and context of its consumption, the characteristics of the viewer, and the wider context. And because one issue here is that we may have, you may have an image that's what in some contexts might be an innocuous image of, say, the female body or a female, a woman's vulva or something. But for a particular viewer, that's this, fantastic kind of pro-rape thing that means this kind of sleazy, horrible thing for them. I mean, viewers can be agentic and creative and can make sense of things in really troubling or not troubling ways. So I think it's complicated. It's certainly easier to judge the ethics or otherwise of pornography in terms of its content because that's kind of visible. But I think all those other factors you've described are also significant. Yeah. But having said that, I don't think that images are, are infinitely polyvocal. I don't think, I think that images in general lend themselves to certain sorts of readings more than others. Otherwise advertisers wouldn't bother making ads. And And so I think most pornography lends itself to certain sorts of readings which are often troubling. I actually just took it for granted. That, what we'd be doing in terms of shifting men's relationships to pornography is part of a kind of broader effort to do with kind of building sexually just cultures. So in a sense, I kind of left it off, and that was foolish, I think. Yeah. So I do quite a lot of work about how you how you teach young men about consent, in a sense, why consent is important and how to do consent. And so, for example, last year I was commissioned by the Australian Defence Force, which is they're the professionals who kill people, by the Australian Defence Force, to write a program for the military. That was very facetious, don't quote me on that. Write a program for the military about kind of healthy relationships and sexual consent. And this was in the wake of a series of sexual assault scandals by young men at a military university in Canberra in Australia. And so it was this, program about consent, about why consent is important and how to do consent. And it seems to me that if we had kind of powerful norms of sexual consent and a kind of widespread practice of sexual consent in our culture, then porn that celebrates, in anal intercourse or, facials, ejaculating on the face, kind of, in some ways, probably wouldn't be an issue, because people would see that and go, oh, let's try that. What do you think? Yeah, let's do that. I'm interested in that. No, I'm not interested in that. They kind of work it out and negotiate it. But we have a context where, in fact, we normalise coercion and normalise the absence of consent, and the absence of resistance equals consent, and so on. And so some of this stuff plays itself out in really troubling ways because of that broader absence of a kind of just sexual culture.
You mentioned Gail Dines earlier. How do you justify using the work of a well-known trans misogynist when your work is supposedly about sexual ethics and about minimising harm?
I'm out of my depth in that debate, actually.
I don't think it's responsible for you to be out of your depth here.
Say again?
It's not responsible for you to be out of your depth here, I don't think.
It's not responsible. Can you say that again, please?
It's not responsible for you to be out of your depth.
Yes, it's not. No, that's true. No, that's exactly right. And so I drew on Diane's work on Pornoland, a year ago when it came out. And she makes arguments about pornography that I find compelling and I draw on. And thinking about it now, I think I can do that while sort of energetically criticising her arguments about other things. And I don't think that the material on which I drew in drawing on Pornoland is itself sort of transphobic or trans-misogynist. Don't know. And I don't know her work on transgender, actually. I have no idea about her work on transgender. I know there's this heated debate among different schools of feminism and gender politics about these issues, and I haven't worked out what I think about them.
So to be clear here, you haven't worked out whether you actually include trans women as women? You haven't worked out whether that's the school of feminism for you?
From the little I know about those debates, it seems to me that what people call TERFs are profoundly wrong. Yeah, but I don't feel fluent in those debates. So my, if you like, gut impulses, there's no such thing, but my impulses from the little I know about those debates, so I'm trying to be as frank as I can about this. I don't know these debates well. And my sense so far of the little I know of these debates is that the Sheila Jeffreys of the world are seriously and profoundly wrong. Yeah.